A 98-year-old woman sits in her living room while heavily armed officers breach her door with military-grade force. You are watching this because it seems like an isolated tragedy or a simple case of police overreach. But the real stakes here go far beyond one household or one bad day for law enforcement agencies. This incident is not about catching a criminal. It is a strategic signal that the state has shifted from governing to surviving, and understanding why changes how you see every political crisis unfolding today. When we look at standard governance, states operate like well-tuned engines running on predictable rules. Laws are applied consistently because the system believes in its own stability. But when a regime enters survival mode, everything changes instantly. The shift from routine administration to emergency suppression is not gradual. It is a hard switch triggered by perceived existential threats. Think of an engineering safety valve that snaps shut only when pressure reaches a critical threshold. That is exactly what happens inside the state machine when internal stability fractures. Researchers analyzing political regime dynamics using physics-based models have identified a specific tipping point where states transition from democratic stability to instability. They found that during transitions between autocracy and democracy, there is a measurable surge in the propensity for internal conflict. This statistical finding reveals something disturbing about modern power structures. When the system detects fragmentation or node failure within its own network of control, it abandons procedural legitimacy and deploys maximum force against vulnerable targets to reassert dominance. The raid on that elderly woman was not an anomaly driven by a rogue officer's bad judgment. It was a calibrated response from a regime facing what it perceives as an existential threat. In system architecture terms, this represents a move away from distributed consensus where the rule of law applies equally, toward centralized authoritarian control where force becomes the primary tool for maintaining cohesion. The state is no longer trying to solve problems through negotiation or legal procedure because those protocols have failed to maintain its stability. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. This behavior stems from what analysts call digital domination. Modern regimes rely on algorithmic influence and information control to manage their populations without constant physical coercion. As long as these informational structures hold, the state can govern with a relatively light touch. But when algorithms fail or information leaks threaten the regime's narrative, the cost-benefit analysis shifts dramatically toward high-force deterrence. The leadership decides that diplomatic resolution is too slow and risky compared to immediate suppression of dissent through overwhelming force. Consider how this plays out in real-world scenarios. A state does not deploy military assets for civilian policing because it has extra weapons lying around waiting to be used. It deploys them only when the standard governance protocols have collapsed under critical load. The presence of tanks or armored vehicles at a residential raid indicates that the regime no longer trusts its own police forces to handle internal threats without external reinforcement from paramilitary units. This is not about law enforcement efficiency, it is about signaling strength to potential rivals within the power structure itself. The deployment of military-grade capabilities for civilian policing serves as an early warning indicator of internal power competition. When you see a 98-year-old woman targeted with such aggression, you are witnessing the state's leadership testing its own resolve and sending a message to other actors that survival takes precedence over legitimacy. This is why these incidents often cluster together during periods of political transition or economic crisis. The regime knows it cannot rely on voluntary compliance anymore, so it must force order through fear. There is an interesting tension in this dynamic regarding citizen resistance. Technical resources exist for individuals to resist surveillance and enhance their digital autonomy against state algorithms. However, the data does not show that these individual countermeasures effectively mitigate state coercion during active internal crackdowns. While citizens can improve their privacy, they cannot stop a regime from deploying military assets if it perceives an existential threat. The lack of real-world adoption metrics regarding citizen resistance efficacy suggests that regimes successfully suppress dissent through hybrid means without triggering total institutional failure in every instance. This complicates the narrative that forced deployment signals inevitable collapse. It remains possible for states to use these brutal tactics as a graduated spectrum rather than a binary state transition. A regime might deploy military-grade force against a specific target, achieve its immediate suppression goal, and then return to a semblance of normal governance without collapsing entirely. The signal is not always that the end has come. Sometimes it simply means the leadership feels cornered enough to try something desperate. The key insight here is recognizing that domestic raids on vulnerable targets are strategic signals rather than isolated legal incidents. When you see military equipment used in residential areas, do not ask what crime was committed or whether due process was followed. Ask why the state felt it needed to switch from governance protocols to survival mode right now. The answer will tell you far more about the regime's internal stability and its perception of threats than any news report can reveal. This shift represents a fundamental change in how power is exercised within modern societies. States are moving away from the predictable application of rules toward emergency fail-safes that prioritize immediate threat suppression over procedural legitimacy. The raid on an elderly woman is not about her, it is about what she represents to a regime terrified of losing control. It is a warning shot fired into its own society, signaling that the state has entered survival mode and will use whatever force necessary to maintain power. Understanding this dynamic allows you to see patterns in current events that others miss. You stop asking if an incident was legal or illegal and start analyzing what it reveals about the regime's internal calculations. The deployment of military assets against civilians is a symptom of systemic fragility, not just police brutality. It indicates that standard governance has failed to maintain stability, forcing leadership into a corner where they must choose between losing control or using extreme force. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.